right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Corbin Campbell, Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the School of Education at American University, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our webinar series, and especially this evening. I wish I could be welcoming you to our actual beautiful and sustainable campus, but I am very pleased to have you joining us virtually this evening, and especially given that this webinar series is focused specifically on parents and caregivers. I am so deeply appreciative of the time that you're giving to think together about how to support our children and our students through this very challenging time. And so what we know is that in this educational time and space during COVID-19, parents need new tools and also new ideas to continue to foster teaching and learning and support for their children in an equitable and also excellent way. And this is exactly why the faculty and staff at the American University School of Education has formed this webinar series. And I feel deeply appreciative to the faculty who have given their time to support our community in this endeavor, like Dr. Owen, who you'll be hearing from today, and also from the SOE staff who have given up their nights to be here to support us. And also for the panelists that Dr. Owen will be introducing in a minute. But this is actually the last of our Wednesday night evening webinar series, but we will be looking forward to we've been holding them weekly. Going forward, we will be holding some additional events, and so you'll hear more about that, but it might be more on a monthly kind of basis. We've been really enjoying this time of giving expertise on various topics that we thought that parents might really deeply resonate with, and we'll look forward to doing that in new and different ways going forward. But tonight I have the pleasure and privilege to introduce our faculty member who has agreed to give this webinar and put together a really incredible panel for you all this evening. So tonight, as you all know, we're talking about a topic that could not be more relevant in a traumatic and isolating time like COVID-19, which is around behavioral and mental health of our children and students. And so Dr. Laura Owen is the director of our Center for Postsecondary Readiness and Success. And also she's a research associate professor at the School of Education with us at American University. And her research focuses on evaluating the impact of interventions and programs designed to address the persistent equity and access issues that so many students across the country face. But I also want to mention that she has several publications on both college access as well as school counseling, and her school counseling roots run deep. One of the things I deeply appreciate about Dr. Owen is just how thoughtful she is about several of the complex school counseling issues that our students face, and the connectedness that she has across the nation to try and support students in dealing with a variety of school counseling issues. And she draws upon this knowledge of school counseling and college access issues, both in her research as well as in her eye toward broader national policies. And so we're so fortunate to have Dr. Owen leading our center. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Owen to tell us about our panelists, actually in just a moment, because I did want to mention as well, just in terms of the format of this webinar, we have disabled the chat function, but if you do have questions for our panelists, you can type those into the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Dr. Owen will tell you more about when the panelists will answer questions. But if you have questions throughout the presentation, you can put them in there, and then she'll answer them at the appropriate times. And so with that, I'll pass it off to you, Dr. Owen.
I'll unmute myself first. Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that everyone will be able to see our PowerPoint presentation for tonight. And I really just want to start by letting you know how honored I am to have such a talented and knowledgeable group of panelists tonight. I consider all of these colleagues to be my friends. Some I know better than others, but they are each experts in the field that they will be speaking about tonight. And I know that every single one of them could do multiple days of training, and what they're going to try to fit into 10 minutes to share with you tonight. And so we're really fortunate to have all of them with us tonight. I'm going to share with you who will be on the panel, and then I'm sure each of them will tell you a little bit more about their background. But we have Dr. Sophie Philibert, who is from the University of North Florida. Each of these panelists have worked as school counselors and also come from higher ed and mental health background as well. We have Dr. Kara Aiva from Rowan University, Dr. Ian Levy from Manhattan College, and Frida Trujillo from Albuquerque Public Schools. And so you will be delighted as you get to know them better tonight. We're so thankful for each of you who have made time to join us at 7 o'clock at night on a busy week. We know that you're all managing so many things right now, and we're just thankful that you made time to join us tonight. I went and I took a look today just to see what's out there today, what articles have been written, what was published today that was really talking about this idea that we're actually seeing what some are referring to the next pandemic, or possibly a shadow pandemic. And you can see, like, NPR had a couple of pieces today on mental health and the concern around COVID-19 and how it is impacting mental health. And we know that it is something that we truly need to be addressing, talking about how we can stay well, ideas for coping and staying healthy, and ideas for helping our children as they are also going through this new experience. And so I know from our panelists tonight, you're going to get so many tips and ideas to think about. And we think that obviously this is a really important topic and something that we will be talking about, not just in the weeks to come, I think the months to come for sure, and possibly for a few years. There was a recent study that was done, Every School, Every Community Beyond COVID-19. I have the link for it at the bottom of the screen if you want to take a look at this. This was actually a grassroots level where they put together a needs assessment where they went to education organizations and racial justice organizations, and they surveyed over 600 students and families from low-income communities of color in more than 20 school districts in California. The report is well worth your time to look at and to read after the webinar, but I did want to highlight one piece of the survey because I think it really touches on what we're seeing and what we're hearing as both faculty, school counselor supporters, teaching school counselors in training, is this need around mental health support, and also focusing on helping students to address belonging and relationships as more and more students feel isolated from their friends, from the activities that they were planning on doing. These mental health issues are coming up, and then the need for support around how to stay well. I shared in another webinar that I did that one of the ways that I knew that I was starting to become a little more anxious about what was going on was I couldn't sleep. I lost the ability to fall asleep, or if I did fall asleep, I'd wake up in like an hour or two. And so I know our panelists tonight are going to share with you some of the things that happen when we experience stress and how that can impact us. But I think we all have a need to think about how to stay well and healthy. And so I'm going to turn the time over to our panelists now, who are going to present to you. And then there is the feature in the Q&A box where you can ask questions. We're going to try to hold those questions to the end and then answer all the questions. This is for you. We're doing this for you. So we really want to encourage you to ask questions as you have them. And then we will come back and answer those questions at the after everyone has had a chance to talk. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Sophie Philibert from University of North Florida. Sophie, I think you're on mute.
That happens all the time, sorry. But I'm really glad to be a part of this esteemed group and to be with the viewers that are looking on right now. I mean, we had this, when I was invited to speak on this, it was really exciting because we are having these conversations. In my roles that I have here at, in Jacksonville, Florida, I'm able to speak to a wide cross-section of people who are on the educational front line of this crisis. And so it was really interesting. So my remarks tonight will be just about my observations and also the fact that we're giving a lot of assurances, not just to parents and to students, but to administrators and leaders, other faculty members. I've had friends who have, been as accomplished and themselves teachers of teachers and counselors, and yet they're saying, Sophie, I'm not being a good parent right now. What do I do? And so it's just something that we're all under. And so, so I want to offer my remarks as a message directly to parents, and also include messages that you can think about for students and for the administrators who have to be, the school professionals and administrators who have to serve you as well. And so the next slide that I have is a slide that I often like to use with my students. You can go to the next one too. Yes, thank you. I used this recently, actually right before the COVID lockdown, before we had to shut down. I used this as a prompt to my students who are preparing to be school counselors, and just to get their feedback on there. And this sort of gives an idea of it's a snapshot of what some of the mental health matters were that we were experiencing prior to COVID-19. This one is about from fall 2017. Imagine that 3 years ago. And so now we see that with the COVID-19 that we're having a renewed focus on mental health issues in school. And so mental health issues predate COVID-19. A lot of us are not surprised that these are happening, but I think a silver lining can be that students, parents, whoever may have been shy about talking about those can feel more emboldened in that we are all under this common threat, this common concern, regardless of how you're experiencing it, but we can all say that we're being affected by this globally. And so I think that is giving some people some more comfort and more assurance that they can reach out and say, this is really affecting me in a way that I did not expect, So that's the silver lining, I think, out of all this. And the fact that we are able to talk about it more freely and reimagine how we provide services. And so some consideration, thank you, Laura, is that we are all under this onset of a sudden event, the trauma of that. We can imagine now how this might be affecting those who have had mental health issues, and even triggering for those who may not have thought that they would be affected by that. But we're seeing, new cases of that as well. We're also seeing increased reports of stress and anxiety. The students and the parents may not themselves call it stress and anxiety, but we can recognize as professional, this is probably a symptom of stress and anxiety as a result to that too. And also we want to offer just some, some messages, some specific strategies, and just overview of what to consider as you're thinking about this crisis. Go to the next one. Okay. And so, like I said, I want to just give my brief remarks as a message to particular groups that I work with. And so for students, I actually had a conversation with a student this morning, and I asked her, a ninth grader, what has it been like for you so far? What's been the most helpful thing for you, or the least helpful? And for her, she's one of the few that I've heard. She's like, I actually enjoy this time alone because I've actually gotten better grades and I'm by myself, and I like the, the distraction-free, atmosphere. And I've heard another range of that with students. I miss my school, I miss my teachers. And so what I would tell students, if you were listening, would be that both you and the adults in this situation, we're all trying to figure it out in real time, right? We've never had this. And so be patient with us. You're going to feel a sense of loss because for some students, school was the safest place for them, right? And so now this has been removed. We have to sort of think about that. And so acknowledging that there's a sense of loss, and it's okay to have that sense of loss. There's no right or wrong way to feel about what's going on, and I would say that to all groups, there's no shoulda, woulda, coulda about it, but it is, and so there's no right or wrong. Don't feel, don't beat yourself over the head because you're feeling a certain way about it, and be honest with your feelings. And finally, for the students, reach out. I know from our end, we're reaching out to a lot of students. We have a push out model, but if they're not pushing out to you, you certainly have the right, and you should reach out to the adults and the trusted professionals working with you. And to the families, and we want to make sure that we're inclusive of family. The families can look so different. They're not just a typical, mom and dad, but families can be a range of people who love and care for students and that are responsible for them. And so with that, you're being tasked with unimaginable, I don't want to call it a burden, but a responsibility, right? To monitor your child's school in a way that was very different and just unexpected, and that's going to be okay. You're feeling a sense of loss as well, because school provided so many resources for you in terms of childcare, sometimes food, the educational piece. And so there's a sense of loss that parents are going to feel and families are going to feel. So acknowledging that as well. As I mentioned earlier, parents and families from all backgrounds are experiencing very similar changes in house dynamics, and so people feeling really inadequate or not feeling they can do this, not having the energy, that's okay. And so acknowledging that and trying to find some ways to start from there. And again, no right or wrong way to feel, and reach out if help isn't being offered to you by your school. And then finally, my remarks are going to just be towards the professionals that have to work with your school or with your family. And so with that, we have school and educational professionals who are on the front line, educational front line. And the message that I would give to them is, you can go to the next one, Laura, to the professionals, the school professionals. Yep. And so for those who may have, many of us are going to have multiple roles. We're not going to all just be parents or just be family or students or be administrators. And so we're going to have these different roles. And so for those who are working with the professionals, be patient with them. Professionals, have patience with the families. Expect that we're going to see an increase of anxiety and stress symptoms, and have appropriate plans in place and personnel, and to intervene with that. There again, even for the administrator, there is no right or wrong way to feel about it. However, we do have an increased burden of responsibility to respond to the parents and the students, and so we do add that to our professionals, that they have to be responsible, culture responsive. But there we have resources and even mandated by law to support the families, and so that is an extra burden or extra responsibility for. I keep calling it a burden, but it's not a burden. And so be aware of your own mental health and self-care. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And again, reach out to colleagues. This is what we're doing tonight, right? Talking to each other, encouraging each other, sharing best practices. And so know that if you're working with a school with your child, that they are also relying on their colleagues and professional organizations, state organizations, to make sure that they're doing the best and they're providing the services as we see fit, appropriate for the platform that we're having to use. And so again, we are in it to a certain extent together. People are having different outcomes. However, there are some things that are common among that, and we want to just give assurances and give some concrete strategies and resources that you can use away from use at any point. So I think that's all I got for you. I didn't want to go on because we have so much more coming after us. So thank you.
Thank you. And to just reintroduce myself, my name's Kara Aiva. I am currently an associate professor and trained school counselors, administrators, and school psychologists to work in both K-12 and higher ed settings. I also run inclusive pre-college programs for both middle school and high school students. And I'm also speaking to you today as a parent who also has a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old also in our house, and a spouse who is also a teacher, inclusion middle school teacher. And so I say this to say that I understand what you are going through as well on some level, and that I use this example. There's 3 times a day, 3 times a week where all 4 of us, all 4, my 2 kids, my spouse and I, who have to be on a Zoom call at the same time. So you can imagine what that's like from a chaotic standpoint. And here's what I can say to you first and foremost, just from an experience. Why am I muted? Okay. Are we good? Okay, Laura, can you slip to the next slide? I want to say this first and foremost, that we started this and I thought that homeschooling was going to be like, okay, we got this and we're in education. And it turned into an hour and a half, basically a day, that my kids, one gets an hour, one gets maybe 30 minutes. And that's really how we've minimized this. So I say this to say that you're don't compare yourself to others, that you're doing the best job that you potentially can, and do what's reasonably possible for you to maintain work-life balance, whatever that looks like for all of you. But I can say that self-care is critical. And in a time where everyone, particularly, with kids, is not, okay. When you're having kids who are coming at you nonstop, and as my spouse likes to say, we're getting demands all the time. Self-care becomes one of those things that you tend to put to the wayside for our children. But just know that it is something that's really critical for you as you work through this process, and don't feel guilty about that. To find what those ways look like for you. And I'm going to be honest, I do find a lot of time in the bathroom. It's just quiet. I wake up really early at 4 o'clock, and so I don't have to listen to anything else but my own thoughts. So with that being said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on. One of the things that I've been doing is meeting with all of our school counselors in the state of New Jersey. And so being able to listen to everything on the front lines, we have a range of where students are feeling, and it's a spectrum. And this started really early on. For instance, we have what I would call students who are for the first time thriving. And I'm not sure if your child falls into this category, but we have a lot of students, like Dr. Filbert said previously, who had mental health, and social anxiety was a huge part of that, anxiety in and of itself. And so having to not leave their house and stay in their aspect of comfort, we're actually seeing this in telecounseling too, in the spaces that they're in, that being home, if it was a safe place, if it is and was a safe place for them, that they're actually doing better. And then we have students who are really just surviving. And that's not just students, that's obviously also parents and families as well. And you can see some of the feelings that are associated with it. What we have seen is a huge shift in our middle school, specifically high school students, that some parents who have fiscally lost jobs, that a lot of our high school students have flipped, and they're bringing home a lot of money, and they are considered essential workers. And so now parents also find themselves in a role reversal. And so that also has a lot of feelings associated with that as well. Laura, if you can hit to the next slide. So with that being said, some students had already had essential worker jobs, and some were, in order to contribute to the family, are going out. And what that does do is decrease the value and the emphasis on academics right now. And if that's what people need to be able to survive, that's okay too. And that's just something for you to be able to communicate with your schools. And just to see what's happening in your own kids, here are some patterns that we've seen. Some really see this as a way to be able to be very action oriented. You've seen a lot of people and adults do this too, with sewing masks or putting out rainbows or putting the rocks. Those are healthy coping skills. They feel like they're contributing. So if this is something that one of your students are doing, to definitely be able to continue to encourage that. And some are hyper-focused on academics and are actually still doing well or better than they've previously done, because for them it's the structure, it's the outlet, and it's how people feel. And then there are others that don't want to do academics, and I'm gonna get into that in a little bit, and just want to sit and play video games. And as Dr. Filbert said, there's no right or wrong way to experience this pandemic. And so you might have been angry about your kid previously for always constantly doing other things and not school. And you might still find yourself in that scenario right now, but keeping in mind, it also may not be the easiest thing for them to focus on. We also have, unfortunately, a lot of marginalized communities who are in spaces and places where they can't go outside and get fresh air, which is also a healthy coping skill, or even get fed. And then we have a lot of parents who are essential workers. And here in the state of New Jersey, we have a lot of parents who are essential workers who also have chosen to self-isolate from their family. And so we have a lot of students here who are with maybe family members, maybe friends, but have been separated. And so really re-emphasizing academics has been a hard transition for some of those students. And then we also go back to, well, if parents need to work, and this might be you too, then there's a lot less supervision and structure at home. And no one's faulting anyone on this. We understand that this is the reality of what we're doing. And so even trying to put on another layer of school on you as a responsibility, as Dr. Philip put it, is a little hard. And then we have we just talked about this, we have a lot of abuse and substance abuse on the rise. And I also am going to say this specifically for our middle school and high school students. They have started to get what I will call a little social distance crazy, but not necessarily that word, meaning they want to go outside, they want to see their friends, and so they're starting to take a lot more risks. And so as a result of that, or not able to cope, we are seeing an increase of what I'll say, sneaking out of the house and or engaging in substance abuse. So just something for you to be mindful of as a parent. we share this. I think Laura actually found this originally, but I'm saying to that a lot of our students, even though they may not be saying anything, or you might think that they're doing okay because they're going on and you're checking that they're doing work, what we don't know is what they're internalizing. And so this parent posted this, that her child had written about her perception of what COVID looked like, but it's a really stark reminder that if we're not processing and we're not having conversations with our own kids, then we really don't know where they are. And we also may not know how to reach our kids. And so I would just say to use the interests. Some it's drawing, some it might be video games. For my daughter, it's really just walking while she's on her, like talking while she's on her scooter, or coloring with them. And so there's a lot of strategies that they'll go over moving forward, but this is an important reminder that you don't know what's going on in their head, and to be able to continuously ask. Yeah. So we mentioned some of this, but there's a lot of loss. We talk about the traditional things like end of year ceremonies, graduations, kind of rites of passage of being in school that have been so traditional for a long period of time, right? And it is one of those losses, but there's so much more loss associated with this. There's the loss of access to friends. Now, I want to be clear, you might have a child who could care less whether or not they want to socialize, but we have others who are dying for some sort of social interaction. And so a lot of times teachers are hosting some sort of meetings online, and you can tell the students who are flocking to that really need that. So if that's something that your child is doing, it's also something that they're craving, to just be mindful of what that social interaction looks like and how you might also be able to create that for them. And there are also some have lost in access to safety. We talked about school can be one of those safe spaces. And part of it is the routine. Part of it is we've institutionalized that they've been going to school for so long. And to all of a sudden have that ripped open from them is really hard. And particularly if you are a parent of a special needs kid, we also know that transitions are extremely hard. And so that is probably still something your child could potentially still be processing right now. And I say this as a parent of a child who is on the spectrum and having to go through those motions as well. They've lost comfort, they've lost control. And you as a parent know this because you feel this every day, right? We've literally lost control. We can't plan, we can't predict. The only thing we can really handle is what's happening in our household. And even then that's really hard, particularly if we're trying to balance and keep up with work. And so we've lost that ability to be able to predict what happens in our lives. You also lost a lot of check-ins. Believe it or not, you don't realize how many people you actually see as you're driving, as you're walking into places, as you're walking into buildings. And at one point in time, they might have seemed so minimal, but now they're so huge. So when you are going to the grocery store or you're able to get outside and exercise and people are starting to say hi a little more frequently, you realize, wow, that was a really huge, significant part that we no longer have. The freedom and the risk-taking is what I was really explaining earlier about our particularly, I would say 5th grade and above, starting to take a little more risks. Risk is a part of that development. Rebelling against parents was a part of the development. And now it looks different, but their physical safety and their physical health is at risk as a result of that. And so this is a really interesting place to be. And if not, and not being in those in situations and being at school and having those conversations, there is also a loss of identity development, who they are with their friends, who they are in all of the activities that they went to, who they were as an academic. And that is something that, we wouldn't know necessarily how to verbalize ourselves, let alone kids being able to verbalize that. And there's a lot to be able to process and take that in, and they don't know what that's like. I promise I'll be quicker. Woo. I just put this up here to let you know that also associated with the loss really of life too, and what that looks like. This is what grief and loss looks like. There are the 5 stages. And I put this up here so that you can refer back to, because there's a really good stress relief exercise. But this doesn't necessarily encompass all the things that they could be feeling. So I'm gonna show you a little bit about some of the symptoms you could see. So this is really what you see for anxiety. And we talk about seeing this in the classroom, and now it's going to look a little different. Anger, being angry all the time is really a sign of anxiety. We always talk about trying to find the rationale behind the anger. But if that has increased over time, that is also an indication for you. As Dr. Owen said, difficulty sleeping is another one. I can tell you just really briefly that sleep patterns can vary. I have a child who processes in their sleep. And so if it's a time that is very stressful and there is anxiety, then he's up at 2 a.m. and he's wired and he continues to go because that's how his brain processes. But I can also tell you that we've also seen kids who have they stay up late and then they're not available all day. So then their work's not in time. And then it goes into the cycle of teachers reaching out to you. And it's not that they're not doing it. They're not doing it during traditional school hours anymore. And that's okay. Defiance is another one, just like anger. Chandeliering, now this is something just to be mindful of. If your child has not really anger or occasionally talks back, but goes from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, that's a huge indication that there's a lot that's been building up and internalizing over a period of time. The lack of focus is another one of these. I personally can tell that it takes me a lot longer to do things, and I didn't realize it was probably attributed to the anxiety that's happening now, both as a parent and kind of the workload and responsibility of schooling. Avoiding and not wanting to get on the computer to do work is another sign. It has nothing to do with the academic piece. It really is something else is going on, and it could ultimately be a level of anxiety. And then over planning is another one. And I think we as adults do this all the time. The more we plan, the better we feel. We can check things off. But if there's continuously over planning in an unpredictable world, that's another sign for you. And just so you know, this other visuals here is really about how people are thinking and reacting about COVID, and it gives you some strength-based scenarios for you able to speak back to with your child. I'm almost out of time, so I just want to talk briefly about executive functioning. Executive functioning is something we used to talk about only if a child was diagnosed with ADHD. But what we have found is when a student is experiencing trauma or anxiety, that we also lose executive functioning. And this is a major thing that we really are starting to teach teachers on how to accommodate for everyone. First and foremost really is focus. That's a really hard thing to do, and so is impulse control. They're not thinking before they speak, they're not thinking before they write, because they don't have the ability. And then task initiation, just turning on the computer, or you have it all set up and their Google Classroom is set up and they won't go on to be able to do it. You are angry and you're upset and you're yelling, but their brain won't allow them to physically be able to do that. I joke about people sometimes getting divorced over feeling like people are lazy, and it's not. Their brain neurologically won't allow them as a result of anxiety, and also ADHD, but specifically in this case, anxiety. And the other thing I want to talk about is organization and planning. So one of the things that we did when we translated into virtual and remote learning is we put everything online, right? And so we assume that that also translates from an organizational structure. And it doesn't. Even if teachers are really good about keeping things in folders and laying out plans, it is really hard for students, no matter how well they did academically before, to be able to keep track of organization. And then we're asking them to think, to execute, to write sentences, to write reflections, or whatever it is that they're doing for class. And to be able to prioritize and plan that out is extremely hard, which then also relies on us to do a layer and level of coaching, because it's not that somebody else is. But if this is something that you're seeing in your child, reaching out to your teacher or your school counselor is definitely the way to go. And that's it. I'm gonna let our esteemed colleague go next.
Thank you. It's actually kind of a perfect foundation, because I'm going to talk a lot about today some ways that we can support youth in developing some of those sort of internal coping repertoires that we're sort of speaking about. So sort of a nice lead in. So my name is Dr. Ian Levy. I'm a professor at Manhattan College in the Bronx. I'm going to talk about culturally responsive mental health practices in schools. So I'll talk first a little bit about kind of the work that I did when I was in schools, very briefly, but then how that can be translated to work that is done at home that youth can engage in regularly as a means to sort of process the emergence of difficult thoughts and feelings. So when we think about mental health, there are also, as some of my colleagues have alluded to earlier, a slew of disparities that exist. And I just thought it was necessary to sort of cover these. These are stats that I would share when talking about mental health before COVID, so they've only been exacerbated. And so when we think about mental health access, generally speaking, we know that young people of color are 1/3 to 1/2 as likely to receive access to mental health services compared to more affluent and mostly white youth. We know that a lot of the times that the modalities that counselors are using are rooted in sort of white Western cultural norms. And so I like to say they were sort of built by and for white people. And so as a result, when we think about services and the way that we utilize counseling, we have to consider how we can adapt the existing modalities to meet the needs of youth and to respond to sort of their cultural worlds, right? So when those services are not provided, which historically they've not been, so either they're not available, or if they are, they lack sort of that cultural sensitivity, what that results in is then youth feeling a sense of isolation and distrust towards services. And so when you look at across data, there's tons of data that suggests that young people of color specifically find counselors unrelatable, feel a lack of validation when they visit the counselor's office. And what this comes from and stems from, right, is the lack of services that really feel real for young people. And when we think broadly around teacher prep, so there's a lot of, it's in the discourse, people are talking about social emotional learning a lot, and it's very important that we do talk about social emotional learning. But when you look and I think this is very important to understand, when you look at teacher preparation programs across the country, there are barely any social and emotional learning preparation that happens, right? So it's not often a course that is taught. So while it is most definitely something we need to focus on, I'm not convinced that folks in the building have the requisite training to actually engage in the work that we need to do. So I'll jump forward to the next slide. So that's sort of where the work that I've done as a school counselor comes in, right? So I have a model that I call hip hop and spoken word therapy, which the very short way of explaining it is it's a process through which we can support young people in writing, recording, and performing emotionally themed hip hop music, lyrics specifically. And that could be like over a beat, or it can be a cappella. So that's why that spoken word piece is in there as well. Sometimes youth don't like to write over beats. They just like to stand up at a sort of like a slam poetry night. And that's cool too, right? But it's the act of composing lyrics that are rooted in the things that we've been feeling. And to sort of address one of the claims I made in the prior slide around the lack of sort of cultural sensitivity in a lot of these age-old counseling approaches, it's not to say that they're bad approaches, it's just that they lack that sensitivity. So how can we find things that young people who identify with hip-hop culture are already engaging in, and I will detail what those are in a moment, but I would call those community-defined hip-hop practices, and how can we couple those with some things that we already know historically in the counseling field might work and might actually be better if we can couple them with these really cool things that youth are already engaging in. Jump to the next. So those are a few, and I could go super in depth and talk about this forever, but I'll be very brief. I love talking about it, so bear with me here. But so we'll start with the idea of lyric writing, right? So just lyric writing generally, one of the things that I noticed in my work is that anytime I asked students if they had lyrics written, they would often pull up like the notepad function in their phone. It's memos or notes, different names depending on what sort of generation of phone we're talking about here. Used to be just like a literal book as well, right? That people would have lyrics that they've already composed. So I found that a lot of my students were engaging in lyric writing on a regular, on everyday basis, right? And that was like if they were on the train. I worked in New York City a lot. So if they were on the train on the way to school, they had beats in their headphones and they were writing rhymes over them. They were meeting with their friends to share those rhymes. It was already happening. So how could I use something like emotive journaling, cognitive journaling? There's also emotional writing. There's a lot of literature in the counseling world around the importance of journaling and writing down thoughts and feelings. How could we utilize this in sort of the counseling process, or even at home with young people? We can by asking folks to write rhyme, like literally compose lyrics that are reflective of the specific emotional state that they're in, and then to share those with us so we can then ask follow-up questions around it. The prior presenter was speaking about the need to sort of process the things that youth are going through on a regular basis. We find that sometimes asking youth like straight up, like, how are you feeling today, is not necessarily the most impactful way to ask young people to really emote. But if we were to say, hey, we found this really awesome like beat, it's kind of giving me like this sort of reflective vibe, so why don't we like spend some time writing some rhymes and reflecting on something that we're feeling, and then we'll share those out with each other. And then every single time that you ask, and this is true in hip hop and then also important in the counseling process, anytime that you ask somebody who has composed lyrics to not only recite their lyrics, but to tell you about why they wrote them, they are super excited to tell you about why they wrote them. So naturally, we can get into this really detailed conversation around thoughts and feelings. There's also this notion of collaboration. So in my work, I've had youth, I've had youth collaborate on a song about a shared emotional experience. And I've oftentimes structured the content of the song around something that maybe they're anticipating, right? So I'm gonna have a test next week that I'm really nervous about. So why don't I write rhymes to talk about my preparedness for that, right? Or I'm gonna have a difficult conversation with a friend that I've been fearing having. Let me like flesh out my thoughts and feelings about that conversation, right? So I'm then preparing myself to engage in it, right? And I won't go through all of these. I could go a lot longer, but the idea here is that we pull from something that exists already within hip hop, and then we make it something that can support young people in processing difficult thoughts and feelings. So I'll jump to the next slide here. And so in my work in schools, what this looked like was like creating school studios where youth could sit and engage in this process. So it was a group, but also individual. I generated funding over few years to establish a studio space within the school, but I wanted to give you a glimpse of what that looked like. You can jump to the next slide. And I've also engaged in sort of like long-term work within the group setting, where it's not only just sort of a random collection of songs about things that youth are feeling in that moment, but that we can actually sort of cater the curriculum for long-term group counseling sessions to sort of center in on something that youth find to be particularly important to them, and then write a bevy of songs that are reflective of that. So I've had groups in this example that really wanted to talk about police brutality. And so in writing this mixtape, which we made, which is a collection of songs around police brutality, youth were able to do research around different cases that they wanted to speak about. So they were watching videos online, they were reading articles, right? They were doing all of this work in order to then prepare themselves to write a series of songs, right, that then they recorded, and then they could market. And you could market that online, you could share it on Facebook, Instagram. Now there's like TikTok. I'm sure there's really cool ways to use that with students over rhymes that they've created, right? But the idea is that sort of in order to construct rhymes that are cohesive and construct songs that fit together on a project, we have to do our research, we have to be well informed, we have to be thoughtful. And so that provides us an anchor to support youth in doing like this regular research. And this is something that could be done at home. If you want youth to write around stress, you could have them watch very brief videos on how people deal with stress, and then convert those to a verse that now demonstrates that they've done their research, and now they're writing a rhyme, not only how they deal with stress, but reciting sort of things that they've learned, maybe about the importance of self-care or whatever that video might have shown them or article that they read might have shown them. So it's a way to get students to really critically analyze text, and then also engage in this really fun sort of like cathartic process. Jump into the next slide here. So how can we support students online specifically? I've gotten to some of these, but I'll sort of build on this even more. So if you go on YouTube, one of my favorite things to do is if you go on YouTube and you just search an emotional word and then hip hop beat. So you could be like stress hip hop beat, or like love hip hop beat, right? You can really do this on YouTube. You will find an array of beats that people have made that they've put up online for free that are sort of rooted in the emotional timbre of whatever emotional word you put into that search. And so we can do this with youth at home if we know that they're feeling stressed, or we know that they're feeling angry or lonely. We can find beats that align with that, and then just give them a pair of headphones and say, hey, why don't you engage in some writing, and I'll come check in with you later. There are free at-home recording functions on phones, which are really, really cool. So once you have that YouTube beat online, if you Google YouTube to MP3, you'll find a lot of websites where you can then download that YouTube beat as an MP3. And then very easily, you can upload that into an app. This one's called Spire, which is S-P-I-R-E. you can upload a beat in the cipher, and then as you can kind of see on the little visual on the screen, you can students can record layers of beats through their headphones right on their phone, and send it to their friends or send it to you, right? I've had students do this, and parents have made like songs of their ringtones and stuff like that on their phones that students have written, right? So it's a really cool way of opening up and processing. We can also, you know, for students who have sort of access to Google Classroom, you can have students share with each other different songs that they listen to when they're in specific mood states. So for folks who maybe are familiar, a lot of youth will log on to like Spotify or iTunes, and they have their own personalized playlists that they make. I don't know about you all, but I do this, right? So like I have like whenever I give a talk, like an academic space, I have like my pre-talk playlist. I have all my hype songs that I listen to before I get up there and start like rhyming. Before I defended my dissertation, I had a dissertation playlist that I would listen to while I was writing. I had things, and that was just from like things I've seen, right? I have friends who would have playlists for kind of different moments. And so we can ask youth to create like a, you know, a more sort of like lonely playlist, or you know, a happy playlist or a hype playlist, and then log songs into that, and then they can go and put that on. If they're trying to get work done, they might have their own type of like work related playlist. I will definitely share my playlists with folks too if they want them afterwards. But this is a really cool feature, and I should also say that Spotify has done a really good job already developing mood playlists. So one of my favorite ones is like called the Deep Focus playlist, and I listen to that when I'm writing. But there's a lot of like mood playlists that already exist. I think it's a little more powerful if we have youth create their own, but either way, there are ways that folks can access these. These are really nice ways to just process while listening, because you're hearing rhymes that sort of you resonate with, or you're feeling beats that kind of capture the emotional timbre of what you're feeling. And so these are sort of the practices that I like to utilize. And I will sort of close with just adding one more thing here, which is that, and it's not on this slide, but it's something that came to my mind as I was hearing other people talking. There's been a lot of burgeoning research around Zoom fatigue that's been coming up. And what's important about that, and I think we need to understand like what that means. I think there's been this sort of assumption that like, it's just because there's so much Zoom that's why we're fatigued. And that's sort of how folks have understood this. But what is really fascinating and important for us to understand, especially how we then provide youth access to process emotions. When we get on Zoom, our brains are neurologically wired to recognize people's like facial features, and our brains are working very hard. Right now, you might just be looking at me, but if I was looking at 20 different people, my brain is working 20 times as hard to try to recognize all the faces in the screen. And then I log off and I wonder why I just want to like sleep or play video games. I want to do those things, and youth want to do those things because it's exhausting cognitively to be online in these spaces. So the beauty of kind of the things that I've shared here on this slide is they're all individualized work. They don't require that we log on and look at a bunch of different faces, but they're like, let me sit down in my room with headphones on and a sheet of paper, or just like the notepad function open on my phone, or let me not look at anything and like lay down and close my eyes and listen to a mood playlist, right? So what all of these provide is they still provide youth the option to process. But what they do is they take away a lot of the things that are causing fatigue. Because the fear here is that in attempt to support youth, we've provided all of these amazing things online. But the reality is that when youth log on to these rooms, oftentimes that can add more stress. And so then when we wonder why students aren't showing up for things, even though there's been an array of amazing things created online, it might just be because it's so exhausting to do that. And so we can still support young people, I believe, in a lot of ways if we sort of make it a little bit more individualized. And I've tried to offer some ways that hopefully can support that, but that are also rooted in youth culture, particularly if youth identify with hip hop. So I will stop there and pass it on to the next person.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Frida Trujillo, and I am dually licensed as a school counselor and a licensed mental health counselor. I actually just recently started kind of dabbling in the mental health world. Specifically, my interest is in brain health coaching. So that was really interesting, all the things that Dr. Levy was just talking about, because yes, that part of the brain that doesn't know or gets overwhelmed and doesn't continue to filter. That's a really important point that he made, because that does cause us to become overwhelmed. I've actually been a school counselor for 20 years, and I've worked in the middle school, the high school, and the elementary level, as well as the district office. And middle school actually is where I currently work, and that is my love area. I love the middle school area. So go ahead and turn the slide, Laura. Thank you. So I wanted to kind of just start with wellness tips for you all as parents, because as the previous speakers were saying, you all are having to deal with things at home that you wouldn't normally have to deal with, trying to educate your child, or at least create an environment in which they're going to be learning from home. And so one thing that's really important to kind of help is to create structure, like create a routine. And I know that if you're an essential worker and you're working outside of the home, you're probably relying on somebody else. So working with whoever's staying home with the kids, if somebody's staying home with the kids, is really important to help create that routine, making sure that like there's breaks scheduled, there's time for meals and for exercise. Exercise, especially taking brain breaks, is super important, because they are going to get overwhelmed being on the computer. I know I have to do that. I'm on the computer all day long, and I'm having to take those little breaks too and make sure that I eat, because it's easy to forget to do that. I think not taking things personally is also a really important thing, because everyone's stuck at home and people are, not being able to do a lot of things that they want to do. And so as a result, sometimes we get a little grumpy, right? Maybe we're not getting enough sleep because we're worrying, different stuff like that. So that's a really hard thing to do, but just remembering that we're all kind of dealing with extra stress, and so not taking it personally. I think one of the things that a lot of parents, I know especially even some kids, are trying to, is my speaker working? Because it's saying it's not.
It's working. It was just delayed. Actually, I can't hear you now.
Can you hear me?
There you go. That's much better.
Okay, good. So yeah, so we all want to know what's going on, especially, every state has different rules. And like today, right before this webinar, our governor was kind of giving an update on where our state is and stuff. And so you want to just be careful not to overwhelm yourself with all the information, because it's really easy to go on every day onto the news or keep track of all this stuff. And that's actually going to add to your stress. So just, stay informed, but don't overwhelm yourself. Make sure you're practicing preventative self-care. And some of you may be familiar with this acronym HALT, which basically means don't get too hungry, don't get too angry, don't get too lonely, and don't get too tired. I kind of add on another one, which is don't get too thirsty, because a lot of times when we're not drinking enough water, that can also cause us some stress, and it can also cause us to be foggy brained and stuff like that too. So just making sure that we're kind of doing those preventative self-care things. Exercise and fresh air and sunshine. Oh my goodness, I am like so happy to go outside and get fresh air. And I know the kids are too. I'll see the kids in the neighborhood over here going out. Luckily, I haven't seen them doing like a lot of congregating or anything like that, but they're out there at least trying to get some fresh air. I think really focusing on what you can control too, and there's going to be another slide after this, but making sure that you also use your support system and connect to others using, like Zoom or FaceTime, different modes, Zoom, FaceTime, Google Meets, you know, all the different things that you can use to be communicating with your friends, like book club. If you used to do book club before, now do it online, those sorts of things. And then utilizing emergency crisis lines when you need to. So go ahead and go forward, Laura. Oops, one more back. And this is kind of the things that you can't control. Those are the things for some reason we tend to focus on because our brain is just wired that way to protect us, right? And so it wants to like look at all the things that we need that basically are going to cause a danger. But that's really, those things, if we focus on that, is actually going to be where we get ourselves into trouble with anxiety. So what we want to do is really focus on the things that we can control. So that slide is going to be, Laura, I'm not sure if they're going to be able to have access to the slide. I think this is going to be a video later, right?
Yes, we will. We are recording it and we will make this available to everyone.
Yeah, so you can kind of look at that and then go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah, so this one is more to help promote your child's well-being and brain health. Again, those routines are really important. They need those routines. They actually want those routines, even though, you know, they kind of get upset with us when we create that structure. They really do need it. Bedtime rituals and sleep are really important. So if your children are having a hard time sleeping, I know like when this thing first started, a lot of kids were staying up late and then sleeping in. And then once school started to restart, parents were having a really hard time. At least that's what my parents have reported, is they were having a hard time getting the kids back into that routine and stuff. So trying to maintain the rituals and routines that you do normally is going to be really important to help them as well. And as you can, you know, food is really important, right? Eating healthy foods and supplementing where you can or where you need to. Definitely, these things really impact gut health, and gut health, as we've found, also impacts mental health. So as much as possible, and I know it's not always easy, but just, you know, healthy foods, whole foods kind of things, exercise, fresh air and sunshine again, making time for that, even going out together as a family to go out and walk is really important. Limiting and monitoring video games, social media, and the news from the kids too. Again, they can start to get overwhelmed, but also, you know, you want to make sure that they have time for other things as well, reaching out and connecting in different ways too. Noticing your and their automatic negative thoughts. And as a middle school counselor, one of the things that I love is that we use a lot of metaphors to get the kids to connect with the curriculum that we provide them. So we use the metaphor of automatic negative thoughts. And I'm just going to kind of, I don't know, hopefully you can see this here. We use the little metaphors of the different ants, and we talk to the kids about, you know, what kind of ants do they have, and then how do we get rid of those ants? How do we talk back to those ants? So you can actually Google that, and you can find a lot of stuff on the automatic negative thoughts. I think those are some of the things that can contribute to anxiety and depression. For instance, one of the ants is a fortune-telling ant. You know, we're never gonna go back to normal. We're never going to be able to do this again. That's like a fortune-telling ant in the negative. So just that's one example. And again, helping them to focus on what they can control, helping them build a good toolbox of coping strategies. And one of the things that's going to be available to you, I've provided 2 handouts on coping strategies. One of them is actually from the American School Counseling Association, and one is that I use with my middle school students. So those should also be available. Oops, yeah. Making sure, you know, that you guys are dealing with irritability and anger in healthy ways, remembering like to have kindness and compassion for each other, because it's hard to be stuck in the house with each other for this long a period of time. So just kind of setting some rules around that. What are we going to do when we're upset and angry with each other? You know, taking a time out and then setting a time to come back and talk about it when we're ready to do that again. And then also, I think another important thing for parents to remember, and I think especially middle school, I have this conversation with parents a lot, reminding them, you know, is this behavior developmentally normal, or do you really need to maybe get some extra help for your child? So, Laura, do you want to go ahead? Okay, so most providers right now are actually doing telehealth, which is really good. A lot more people are offering that. So you can actually start to get some mental health services that way. You just need to consult your insurance provider, or you can actually reach out and make sure that some of those providers actually take your insurance. Some of them actually, like in New Mexico, we always have a really long wait list for people. Sometimes you can like go out and get in right away, but a lot of people, it's like a 3-month wait. So if you're really worried about your child's mental health right now, you can actually get a free brain health assessment through Amen clinics. There's a link right there. You can Google brain health assessment, and that can actually give you some really good information as well about some things that you might want to try in the meantime, just to kind of help your child out. You can do one yourself. It's really interesting actually to see the different brain types in the house and how you interact with each other because of your brain type. So that's another thing too. Your school counselor, from your children's school counselor, will also likely have a really good list of local resources for you too. So please reach out to your school counselors. They are a wealth of information, and they can really help you, help connect you to services. And then again, one of the things that I recommend, and this is also one of the things through the brain health assessment too, is start with non-toxic or least toxic and more natural interventions to start. And then if you're having a hard time, definitely get a referral to your psychiatrist or your doctor to get some medication. But to start, you know, try those simple things first. You know, exercise is definitely something, you know, there's lots of all natural things that you can try to begin with. There's lots of wellness apps and videos as well online. You can just Google, there's so many different things, and a lot of places are doing these for free now. You can do yoga, Tai Chi, hypnosis, tapping. You can learn to do all of these sort of self-help things, and you can just Google it and you can find them online for free, a lot of them for free. And then when you need it, of course, utilize the crisis lines, because there are a lot of trained people out there to help when you're in a crisis. And for your children too, you might actually want to get the local, the city, the state, and your national lines and post them on the refrigerator, just as a reminder that you can also reach out to these folks when you're not in a good place. So that's it.
I just really want to thank all of you for what you have shared tonight. I feel like I learned a lot of things as you were each sharing. And I know, like I said at the beginning, I could have given you, each of you, the full hour to share your expertise and just your wealth of experience. So thank you so much for what you have shared. For the parents and the caregivers who are watching this, we just want to let you know that we put together a website full of resources and information, and they have been split into different topical areas. We've tried to provide information both from a mental health and wellness perspective, as well as college advising and making decisions about post-secondary options and looking at career options. So just a wealth of information there, and you've got the link to that website. Just wanted you to be aware of that we are trying to help spend some hours to actually go through all of the information that's out there and streamline it a little bit. So this is another resource that you have, hopefully not over inundating you with too much. I think you got a lot of information tonight. So just want to make sure that you're aware of that. We're going to come back to the Q&A. So I want to just, everybody at the bottom of your screen, I know we're running short on time. If you have any questions right now, if you would go ahead and enter those in the Q&A box, you can put your questions and we'll answer those in just a second. But I did, before we close out, we're going to answer your questions. I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint in a second. And I just wanted to share that I think one of the most encouraging things that I've seen is that there really is a lot to be hopeful for. There's a lot that we can't control right now. However, there are really great things that we're seeing. And I think in our children, and when we start talking about like, how do we cope around all of the unknowns, some of the things that have really kind of lifted my spirits, maybe in days when I feel discouraged about not having control over some things that I'd like to have a little more control over. I've just been really moved by things that I've seen from people around the world. And I just picked, you know, a few of the pictures, but these are different places all over the country and different events where, you know, community has come together and people have reached out to help each other. And I think there's just so much that's been done that if we actually step back and look at that, it just lifts my spirit to know that everyone is trying to come together as a community to help each other, to support each other. And I think if we can remember that and look for that, that also can help us in our wellness and kind of our coping, because sometimes our news focuses on the negative and the less positive. And there are really beautiful things that have happened and amazing things that I think humanity is doing to lift one another in these really uncertain times. Whether it's our medical workers, and I just grabbed a few photos of, I've loved these videos and photos where the medical staff are standing, you know, in the hallways and clapping as their patients are leaving that have been treated. And it's just so moving to me to see not just what our medical community is doing for us, but like they're cheering on all of our well-being and all of our health and wanting us to do well. And then just this last slide, I really believe we're all in this together. And I want to again thank the panelists, because I think even looking at their different areas of background and expertise tonight, all of that coming together, I think made this a really dynamic panel tonight. And so I believe that that's the same way we're all going to get through the pandemic together, and relying on your community, relying on your school staff and your counselors and the resources that are available. I think that that will help all of us. So I did include a slide with emails for any of you. I thought you might want to reach out to people individually that you've heard speak tonight, and maybe you've got a few more questions for them. So you've got the emails here, and like we said, we're going to provide this to you so that you can go back to it and have this information. But I'm going to pop out of the PowerPoint so that you can see all of us now, and I'll take a look at our Q&A. Maybe some of you have already been looking at this. So one question, I'm a licensed professional counselor, certified school counselor, parent of twin 17-year-old boys. One is struggling and showing some evidence by chandeliering. He won't listen. The school counselor's overwhelmed. How, as a parent, can I help my son cope if developmentally he sees it that I don't trust him? Anybody want to jump in on that?
Well, I would just like to say that, I appreciate the question, right? As professionally trained humans in our fields, obviously with our own kids, it's also extremely hard. I have family members who say, stop counseling me kind of deal. But, you know, part of this is we don't know, right? How much of this is really an anger and a loss of everything that is going on. And then the demands that we're placing on them, both from an academic standpoint also from a personal kind of social standpoint that could have been their outlets. And I go back to something that was said earlier tonight about not being able to blame yourself. And I know that you're looking for strategies, and sometimes backing off for a good 48 hours may be a good thing, but it's also something that if you're asking about it and you're that highly concerned, it could be there's a lot that someone's internalizing, and that's a struggle. And that also mean you might also want to reach out and get counseling even further, or even crisis, because we have seen an uptake in things that have happened recently for students who, you know, wouldn't normally affect them the way it does right now, but because of everything going on has really, you know, people afraid of getting in trouble or things of that nature when it doesn't go their way. And depression has really increased. And so I would actually, that if chandeliering is happening now, that seems like it's a little more of a crisis, and I would treat it as such. I don't know about the rest of you.
I would agree.
I would say, I mean, I don't have kids myself, but I have friends who have kids around that age, boys and girls, and what they've done. I mean, this with trauma, not just for COVID, even before that they have tried to reach out to adults that the kids are really comfortable with and that they've had a relationship with, and have them sort of just give them some, not all the information, but give some context and encourage them to reach out to the kids. And we've been doing that too. I did that this past weekend. And so she's like, just sort of talk to them because they really like you, they trust you, sort of get a feel for, you know, what's happening. Another parent, she was on here earlier today, she's saying that her daughter might be a little apathetic and she's not sure what's going on with her, and just some suggestion about, you know, is this normal, is it okay? And so giving some assurances that it could be just the way that her daughter is actually managing the stimuli of what's going on. And so everyone has a range of reaction of how they're going to respond to that and what they can handle. And so just sort of being mindful and broaching with them too. And so that's something I think a lot of parents would like help with. How do I broach that with my child? And so just sort of talking them through and seeing what, you know, what could be appropriate for that child based on their personality. And so I think that's a good opportunity for the parent to reach out and to talk to other parents and people that the child trusts, maybe engage them in the relationship as well in a very careful way, could be helpful, in addition to the professional help too. So.
I think that's one of the things about us being school counselors. I actually just had that conversation with my son last week where he was telling me, I don't need you to counsel me, Mom. So, I mean, I think that's just our personality and how we interact with people, and our children see that differently. So maybe trying to find somebody who your child trusts that's not you to maybe connect with and talk to as well can be really helpful, because then it's not coming from you.
I also think the sibling is not a bad person either if there is an established relationship. You did mention that they are twins. So either a friend and or the sibling in a different way to broach it, and not to break the trust that you have with or the trust that they have with each other, but just so you get a glimpse of hearing what it is that makes you feel that it's not as crisis oriented as it potentially, you know, could be or not, and that you might then be able to take a step back as you work through some of that process.
So I want to really thank everyone. This has run over about 15 minutes, and I know that you're busy and you stayed with us for all of this time. As we shared earlier tonight, we are going to make this recording available to all of you who participated. We will be posting this so that you can watch it again later and see some of those resources. You have access to our emails. If anyone wants to email a question right now, my email is fairly simple. It's owen@american.edu. It's probably an easier one to remember. Feel free to email me you know, after this is over, if there's some questions that you have or some resources that you would like. We really are grateful that you joined us tonight. We wish you the best. We know that this is a difficult time, one that we are all in together, that we are trying to figure out how to do this. And we wish you all health and wellness, and be safe and have a wonderful evening. And we hope to see you in a future webinar soon. And thanks again to all the panelists. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Nice to meet you all.
Likewise, nice to meet you.
all as well. Yeah.